Good morning, History 259. I hope you're well. This is video lecture number 2. Again, filming on my phone, so sorry for the angle, but that's what we have to work with today. I hope you're all well again, safe. It's been a pretty crazy week since we last virtually talked, so I hope everybody's good. And as you know, and as I emailed on Monday, there is an instructional pause until tomorrow, which is Thursday, April the 2nd, a so-called recalibration period. So I'm not expecting that you watch this until Thursday the 2nd, although I'm filming it on Wednesday the 1st. And just to go over a little bit of administrative information regarding the recalibration period, as you see in your amended course schedule, excuse me, our second primary source essay is due next week, Friday the 10th. That's going to stay the same. And the essay itself will be the same in terms of format and content as your first essay. So I'll put instructions on Blackboard today, which is Wednesday, April the 1st, but they'll be the exact same instructions as for the first primary source paper. You'll just need to pick a primary source document that we have discussed since the first paper. And frankly, you have 3 choices. And the good thing is that we're going to talk about all 3 of them today. These are Dunmore's Proclamation, Massachusetts Slaves' Petition for Freedom, and Patrick Henry's letter. And we'll talk about those with specific reference as well to Alan Taylor, American Revolutions, pages 281 to 311. For the topic today, which is the Revolution at Home, Slavery and Nationhood, and this is probably my favorite topic, I think, of the Revolutionary period. It's one that I have a lot to say about, and we'll get into that in a second. But just to return back to the administrative information, next week, our schedule should be exactly the same as it is listed in the amended course calendar. Just to say again, second primary source essay will be due uploaded to Blackboard by Friday, April the 10th. So you'll have a week and a half to create it, or to write it, excuse me. And nothing should be changing moving forward. Of course, if something comes up, I will email you. You never know what will come up in this time. And one final point that I want to make before diving into the theme of the talk today, or of the lecture today, is that tomorrow, excuse me, April the 2nd, is the only chance that I'm going to have to go to Queens College campus. It's quite tight security right now, so I will get our papers tomorrow, the ones that I've mentioned in emails. I've left at campus, so I'll get them, and I will have all of your grades posted on Blackboard by Friday. So I will email you when I do that. Okay, so to the topic for today's class. Slavery and nationhood, the American Revolution at home. So another way of thinking about that is what impact did the institution of chattel slavery have on both the American Revolution itself and the war for independence, but also I think we'll see what impact did the institution of chattel slavery and its relationship to American independence, American nationhood, have on the country moving forward in the future. Arguably one of the most important questions of American history in general. So we'll begin that discussion today. And the first place that I want to start is to begin a discussion that we've had already. It's been a few weeks. We had this the week before the last week we had in class, so that would have been the beginning of March. A discussion we had about the events leading to the American Revolution and the use of slavery as a metaphor. And I think that this is the best starting point for any discussion of trying to understand the relationship of slavery to revolution in our context. So as I mentioned about a month ago, about three to 4 weeks ago, one outstanding, I think is the word I would use, outstanding characteristic about the rhetoric the language of colonial protest in the 1760s and in the 1770s through the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which of course we've discussed, was the growing use of slavery. I'm using air quotes here. The word slavery and the idea of slavery as a metaphor to protest British colonial policy. So, for example, it became common after 1765 for white North American colonists to claim that the Stamp Act, which we've discussed before, so no reason to reiterate what that was again, but that the Stamp Act was an attempt to enslave the colonists on the part of the British Parliament. That, just to take another example, the Townsend Program, which we've also discussed, trade regulations, was an attempt by Parliament to make slaves of white North American colonists. That just to pick something else, the Boston Massacre, just to pick out another famous event. The Boston Massacre was, again, an attempt by the British, in that case, Army, to treat us like slaves, us being white North American colonists. And so this use of slavery as a metaphor to compare their plight as aggrieved colonists to the actual enslavement of human beings became increasingly common. If you remember, just to pick out another example of one that we've all read, in Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, he repeatedly refers to the North American colonies and the North American colonists being treated as slaves or being enslaved. It was very common. But this brings up one of the most important questions, I think, of the entirety of American history from the moment of the founding of the country, 1776. Which is that how could white North American colonists, but especially how could slaveholders, your Thomas Jeffersons, your George Washingtons, etc., how could they, with a straight face, compare themselves to slaves when they themselves were slaveholders? There are a couple of different ways of expressing this. One historian calls it the American paradox, Paradox. Right? How could liberty and slavery expand simultaneously in the same country? How could slaveholders claim that their rights, their natural rights to freedom and liberty and life, property, how could they claim that those are being infringed upon while they, in fact, withheld them from the enslaved? It's the American paradox, or another way of thinking about that is one of the deep underlying contradictions of the American founding moment. And it's one that we have to seriously grapple with because, and I mentioned this in class a few weeks ago, the slaveholders comparing themselves to slaves, Thomas Jefferson, who I always pick on, and I think you know by now, Thomas Jefferson, for example, comparing himself to a slave, text message, by claiming that the Stamp Act, for example, is an effort to enslave colonists. He didn't use slavery as a metaphor. Other slaveholders didn't use slavery as a metaphor, being consciously hypocritical. Because from our perspective in the 21st century, it certainly seems hypocritical, right? But it wasn't consciously hypocritical in the minds of Southern slaveholders. The question is why. It's actually a question that was asked by critics of the North American colonists back in the mother country, in England. And the most famous expression of this sort of rhetorical question is from a man named Samuel Johnson. If you're not familiar with him, he was in England, in the mother country, a famous writer. He created one of the earliest English dictionaries, and was a well-known commentator. So in 1775, in a book that was called, the great title, Taxation, No Tyranny, Taxation is Not Tyranny, which he criticized the North American colonists for protesting the mother country protesting the empire. He said, quote, "How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of slaves?" And it's a fabulous question. How is it that slaveholders, to paraphrase, scream the loudest for liberty? And it's a question worth thinking about, one that you can address in your, or begin thinking about and exploring in your second primary paper. So the use of slavery as a metaphor did a couple of things. One, another text message, one rhetorical, and then a second more practical. The first thing that it did was it led to enslaved people in New England claiming that, in fact, their rights, and I should say natural rights, human rights, were being violated unfairly. And this gets us to one response of the enslaved, and there are more than one, the Massachusetts Freedom Petition from 1773, which I've posted a link to on Blackboard. So if you have a second, go ahead and pull that up. Drink my coffee. Gotta have it. And that is under the content tab on Blackboard. So I'll just wait another minute if you want to pull it up. And then also I would suggest you click on the bottom right, the transcription tab, so that you can just read the transcription and not have to decipher the original document's writing. Excuse me. Okay, so this petition is one of many. So this is just one example from June 1773, if you look at the top of the transcription. So square in this time period of colonial protest, which we've already talked about previously. And this is a petition to the Massachusetts, as you can see in the first line, the House of Representatives of the General Court of Massachusetts, which is the lawmaking body for Massachusetts, colonial lawmaking body for Massachusetts. So this is a short one, but I think it reveals a lot about how enslaved people took white colonists' use of slavery as a metaphor and flipped it in order to make arguments in favor of their own freedom. So just to read this, and we can read this in its full since it's so short. The petition of us, the subscribers, so this was on behalf of several enslaved men. So there we go, sorry. The petition of us, the subscribers, in behalf of all of those who by divine permission are held in a state of slavery within the bowels of a free country, shows that your petitions, this is the important part, your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with other men a natural right to be free and without molestation to enjoy such property, etc., etc., etc. So the most important passage there is the invocation of natural rights, that your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with other men a natural right to be free. So here it's enslaved people using the same language that white colonists used, right? That their natural rights to liberty and property were infringed upon by the Stamp Act, just to take one example. That enslaved people were aware of white colonial protest and the rhetoric of protest, and that they used it to their own advantage by claiming a natural right to be free. And this, as I said, is not the only freedom petition. These freedom petitions only emerged from New England, and specifically from Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts. So the responses of the enslaved in this context of using slavery as a metaphor varied by region. In areas where slavery was a larger institution, where there were larger numbers of slaves, which would be colonies like Virginia, for example, Maryland, farther to the south, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. In those areas where slavery was a larger institution and where slaveholders had more power, we see either no freedom petitions or very few of them, whereas in colonies like Massachusetts, with smaller slave populations, we see more of them. So this did vary by region. I'd also want to note that in the particular case of this petition, this June 1773 petition, it was in the short term unsuccessful, meaning that these enslaved men were not given freedom based on this petition. But as I'll end this talk with, what we're going to see is that this context of claiming natural rights, just as white colonists were claiming natural rights, would become, by the end of the war itself, the first sort of mushroom into the first anti-slavery movement in the Atlantic world. But in a second way, as I mentioned, besides the importance of slavery as a metaphor in rhetoric, the sort of more practical way in which we see slavery as a metaphor in this context of colonial protest become manifested is when we shift our gaze to the South geographically from, in particular, New England, and begin to look at the ways in which slavery was impacted on a day-to-day basis, especially in the largest slave colony in North America, Virginia. Because here we see a very different story than freedom petitions. And the place to start with is a discussion of slavery as a metaphor, but as the deep underlying contradiction, as I mentioned, which we really see play out in Virginia in particular. So let's take the example of Patrick Henry. If you're unfamiliar, and this is discussed in Alan Taylor to quite a bit of detail, Patrick Henry was a leading Virginia slaveholder and patriot, a very harsh critic of the British Empire. It was Patrick Henry that famously said in 1776, "Give me liberty or give me death. Give me liberty from the British Empire or give me death." One of the more famed lines of the American Revolution, one which was spoken in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was its lawmaking body, while one of his enslaved people, a man that he held as property, carried a banner that said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And I think I've mentioned this in class 4 weeks ago, that itself is a deep irony, right? How could a slaveholder be saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," and have ordered a slave to carry a banner that said, "Give me liberty or give me death"? What must have been going through the slave's mind? Give me liberty? Probably. More coffee. So when we look at the actions of people like Patrick Henry and try to think about slavery as a counterpoint to the language of liberty and natural rights, is really when we can see the deep underlying contradictions of the American Revolution, the ideology of the American Revolution. And we see these actually in Patrick Henry's letter to Robert Pleasance, which again is also on Blackboard under the title, I believe, Patrick Henry's letter. So I'll let you go there to click on that on Blackboard, again under content. Just give you a second to do that. And actually, I'll be back. I'm going to get more coffee. But pull up the letter. Okay, can never have too much coffee. Okay, so that should have been enough time to pull up Patrick Henry's letter. So let's go through this. And again, a document that you could choose to write about for your second paper, one of the three. So this is a quite famous, at least to historians, letter, because it really shows the degree to which slaveholders like Patrick Henry struggled with both the language of liberty and natural rights of the American Revolution, but also struggled with their own consciences in a pretty significant way. because Patrick Henry, and this is also true of Thomas Jefferson, was, as an individual, probably the greatest contradiction of this time period, the late 18th century, which is to say a slaveholder who was at least theoretically and philosophically against slavery. Slaveholder who's against slavery. And this letter shows us that. So I'm not going to read this whole letter, although if you write about it, you do need to engage parts that I'm not going to read. But what I'm going to do is go to the third paragraph. So there's, after the introduction, there's a long paragraph, there's a one-sentence paragraph, and then there's a two-sentence paragraph, the third one. This is really the part that I want to focus on, and then there's one other section that I want to focus on as well. But this really exposes the contradiction, the paradox of the anti-slavery slaveholder during the American Revolution. So I'm going to read this section. And to be clear, and this is also mentioned in the notes, if you see the footnote 1 and footnote 2, Robert Pleasance was an anti-slavery Virginian. He was a Quaker who were often known for their anti-slavery beliefs. And so the reason Patrick Henry wrote this letter is, as you can see the very first line, to acknowledge that Robert Pleasance had sent him a book by Anthony Benezet, who the footnote 1 says was the most famous abolitionist, anti-slavery activist of this time period. So the letter concerns anti-slavery beliefs, and it says, this third paragraph, would anyone believe that I am master of slaves of my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living out them. I will not, I cannot justify it. However culpable my conduct, I will so far pay my devoir to virtue as to own the excellence and rectitude of her precepts, and to lament my want of conformity to them. That's a complicated sentence, but it's the first two sentences that are most important. Would anyone believe that I am a master of slaves of my own purchase? I am drawn along by by the general inconvenience of living without them. So what he's saying there, to sort of paraphrase, is that he's aware of the fact that there is a rise in anti-slavery sentiment in North America because of this use of slavery as a metaphor. So that's what that first question is. It's that no one would believe that I decided to become a slaveholder because I purchased slaves. I just inherited them. That's what he's asking. That's the rhetorical question or statement that he's making. I didn't choose, to paraphrase, to become a slaveholder. I didn't buy these slaves. I inherited them. But at the same time, I'm drawn along by the general inconvenience of living without them. I might not like slavery, but I can't imagine a world without slavery. If you think about it in those terms, that's a very clear, I think, paradoxical statement of the anti-slavery slaveholder. I don't like slavery, but I don't want to live in a world without it either. I don't want to have to deal with the general inconveniences. And if we go down to the next paragraph, I just want to highlight a couple of quotes here in which he continues this idea, explaining this idea of the paradox of the anti-slavery slaveholder. He says, I believe a time will come when an opportunity will be offered to abolish this lamentable evil, aka slavery. Everything we can do is to improve it if it happens in our day. But if not, let us transmit to our descendants, together with our slaves, a pity for their unhappy lot and an abhorrence for slavery. If we cannot reduce this wished-for reformation to practice, let us treat the unhappy victims with lenity, which means leniency. It is the farthest advance we can make towards justice. It is a debt we owe to the purity of our religion to show that it is at variance with the law which warrants slavery. So here he makes a pretty clear anti-slavery statement. He says, I think a time will come when slavery will be abolished. If it doesn't happen in our lifetime, let us hope that it happens soon after our lifetimes. And in the meantime, let us transmit to our descendants a pity for the unhappy lot of slaves. So let us make slavery more lenient in the short term, so that in the long term, in future generations, slavery might be abolished. Unfortunately, this did not happen for Patrick Henry, nor for subsequent generations of Virginia slaveholders who may have been anti-slavery in their beliefs. But this does, again, expose what I believe to be the sort of central paradox of the American founding. Now, one other way in which I want to point to the effect that slavery had on the events of the American Revolution is to take a different lens and look at the ways in which the British Empire understood American slavery in the context of, by 1776, 1705 and 1776, an outbreak in war in North America, which is that, especially in colonies like Virginia, the largest slave colonies, at other southern colonies, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, British imperial officials, aware of the use of slavery as a metaphor by slaveholders in North America, began to recognize that if they were going to crush the American independence movement, they were going to prevent the 13 North American colonies from succeeding in becoming an independent nation, that they could use slavery against the American patriots. And this, more than anything, is the most important theme of, excuse me, the most important theme of, I'm fine by the way, of Alan Taylor's selection, pages 281 to 311 from American Revolutions, right? It's that, ironically, for a war which is often said to be a war in favor of freedom and liberty, the emancipatory force, the side which emancipated slaves en masse, was actually not the Americans, but it was the British. Because slaves were seen as internal enemies to the North American cause, as internal enemies. Which incidentally is the name of another book by Alan Taylor, a book about war and slavery in Virginia. And why were slaves internal enemies? Well, simply put, because the existence of a large slave population was a danger to the white slaveholding North American patriots, because slaves had every reason to revolt against slaveholders who denied them their freedom, and through rebellion and through revolt would function as an enemy internal to, but inside the physical spaces of plantations of American slaveholding patriots, so that there would be two enemies, in effect: the British Army out there in the fields. You could think of them as an external enemy, the formal enemy, and the enslaved population in homes and plantations, the internal enemy, so that slaves and the institution of slavery could be used against the American independence movement. And that, in fact, is what happened. This is suggested by Dunmore's Proclamation, the last document that I asked us to look at today. Dunmore's Proclamation was passed in, as you can see at the very bottom. Let me give you a second to pull that up before I start referring to it in more detail. Again, also on Blackboard under content. So, Dunmore's Proclamation, which you have a transcription of, created, or made official, I should say, on November 7th, 1775. So chronologically, just as a reminder, that is after the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, also in Massachusetts, but before the American Declaration of Independence. So predating the Declaration of Independence by almost exactly 7 months. So it was sort of a very uncertain time period. Before also, by the way, the publication of Common Sense, which, if you remember, was January of 1776. So fighting had begun, but a Declaration of Independence and a war was not yet formalized. So this is called Dunmore's Proclamation, and you can see this in the italicized text at the top, because it was made by the royally appointed governor of Virginia, whose name was the Earl of Dunmore. That was his title, I should say. His name was John Murray, but he was from Scotland, the Earl of Dunmore, so it's called Dunmore's Proclamation. And this proclamation is famous to historians because it acknowledges the existence of slaves in Virginia, which is what this applied to, as the internal enemy. So this was an official proclamation that was printed and physically posted in public spaces throughout Virginia. And I'm going to pick up in this document, which I know it's just one big paragraph. I'm going to actually pick up near the bottom. Let me find the first word of the sentence that I want to begin. Here we go. It's about two-thirds of the way down, and I'm starting with the sentence that says, "And I do hereby further declare." This is the most important sentence because here is where it acknowledges the slavery and slaves as the internal enemy, but it also shows us what the British Empire, through Lord Dunmore, the way in which they thought they could use slavery against North American colonists. And he says, "And I do hereby further declare all indentured servants," so not just slaves, but indentured servants, Negroes, meaning slaves, or others appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty, to His Majesty's crown and dignity. What does that mean? Well, if we translate that into 21st century English, it's Dunmore declaring that all slaves and indentured servants appertaining to rebels, meaning owned by patriots that are able and willing to bear arms, aka male indentured servants, male slaves whose masters were patriots, rebels, would be free if they joined the British Army, the Majesty's troops, to assist in the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty, meaning if they help put down the independence movement in Virginia. So that's a major statement saying we being the British Empire, are offering freedom to slaves and servants in Virginia if they run away from their patriot masters and join the army to help put down the American independence movement. So this isn't Lord Dunmore acting as a great emancipator because he was morally against slavery. This was a very pragmatic use of slaves to help put down the war for independence. First of all, it only applied to men, aka those that are able and willing to bear arms. It only applied to men whose masters were patriots. In other words, if a slave owner was a loyalist, this would not apply to their slaves. And it only applied to Virginia. So this is a limited emancipation for wartime purposes. What did this proclamation do? Within 3 months, about 3,000 slaves had run away from patriot masters to join Lord Dunmore's army, where they were formed into something called the Ethiopian Regiment, a regiment of freed slaves. This regiment fought one battle, and then most of the soldiers were killed by smallpox, unfortunately. But what it signaled, and its larger significance, is that the British Empire would use slavery against the American independence movement. In 1779, so right in the middle of the war, and right as we didn't talk a lot about this, but right as the British military shifted their strategy from the northern parts of North America to southern North America, in 1779, the British Empire instituted something called the Phillipsburg Proclamation. Phillipsburg is a town in North Carolina, Philipsburg, Phillipsburg Proclamation, which offered freedom to any slave, man, woman, child of any patriot master, as a broader emancipation movement. So we're seeing the British first with Lord Dunmore and his proclamation, later with this Phillipsburg Proclamation, using slavery against the American revolutionaries, using slavery as a weapon, if you will, against the American revolutionaries. And so one of the deepest ironies of the American Revolution is that if we're thinking about it, as I began at the outset of this little video lecture, if we're thinking about the American Revolution as a liberation movement, with respect to slavery, the Army of Liberation was not the American Army, it was in fact the British Army. So that all told, from 1775, Dunmore's proclamation, to the end of the war, which formally ended in 1783, about 30,000 enslaved people gained their freedom from the British, or gained their freedom by running to the British, gained their freedom from American patriot masters by running to the British, just to be clear. Which is a lot of people, but was less than 10% of the slave population of North America as a whole, which was 500,000. So it's about 6%, if we're doing the math. So a large number, but not enough to dent slavery as a institution across the continent. So this brings us to sort of the end of the lecture, and in Alan Taylor, American Revolutions, there's a lot more detail, as you've read, undoubtedly, about more further examples of enslaved people using slavery and offers of freedom from the British Empire as a weapon against the American Revolution. So in that way, it really fits in with his sort of larger overall thesis, right? That any attempt to blindly celebrate the American Revolution as a liberatory movement should be thought about in critical terms, especially when we look at slavery. It was the British Empire that liberated more people than the American patriots. But I just want to end this talk sort of gesturing forward to the early years of nationhood of the United States, because what the American Revolution exposed, what it generated is a better word, with reference to slavery, is something that would, two movements, I should say, that would continue to persist ultimately, which would lead the United States to a civil war in the 1860s, which we're not going to get to in this class because we're taking this class to 1800. But in effect, what the American Revolution did was this, is that it created a nation in which, especially in the southern colonies, slavery would continue to exist and in fact would grow. Both the number of slaves, but also the geographical scope of slavery would continue to expand across the North American continent. And that's a topic that we'll talk about near the end of this semester. So that another way of putting that is that the United States, from the moment it was founded, was a nation which recognized and allowed slavery to exist and expand. That's certainly true. It's true of the southern states, now no longer referring to them as colonies after the end of the war, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and eventually new states that would form states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, all of which became states after our class ends, but just to give you a sense of slavery's expansion. But what the American Revolution also did, and this refers to some of the comments I made earlier in this talk, is that it unleashed the first ever organized anti-slavery movement in the modern world from the 16th century forward. Right? That if we refer back to the Massachusetts Freedom Petition, the first primary document that we talked about, that the use of slavery as a metaphor led many both enslaved people and free people of color, but also white American patriots, to push for the abolition of slavery in their localities, in their states. So it unleashed the first anti-slavery movement. We see this come to fruition during the War for Independence and immediately afterward in what is called Northern, so this happened in New England and Pennsylvania, Northern State Gradual, Gradual, Emancipation, Emancipation, Northern State Gradual Emancipation, that the New England states like Massachusetts, also Pennsylvania, in the 1780s began to institute processes that would gradually abolish slavery over the course of one generation, about 30 years, within their states. And so this happened first in Pennsylvania in 1780, so during the War for Independence itself. The Pennsylvania State Assembly passed a law that decreed that children born to enslaved mothers after that law was passed would be born not as slaves, but as indentured servants who would become free once they became 28 years old. So providing for a gradual process of freedom. And this was also the case in Rhode Island in 1784. It was also the case in Connecticut in 1784. These states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, passing very similar laws providing for gradual emancipation. In Massachusetts, a little bit of a different story. In 1783, its state Supreme Court, through a series of decisions, declared that slavery was legal and not legal in Massachusetts. So in 1783, the state Supreme Court of Massachusetts declared that all slaves were free because slavery itself was illegal in the state. So this process, again, the unleashing of the first emancipation movement, I think is also critical. And I have to say that it's something that Alan Taylor basically ignores in American Revolutions. Why? Because he's much more interested in discussing the spread of slavery, not the growth of anti-slavery sentiment. But I think both are important. And these are topics that we're going to return to at a later date. Here I'm pulling up our course syllabus. So I'm finished with this particular lecture. Again, sorry about the angle, but I'm still using my phone, which is much better than my computer for recording. So I hope that this video lecture helped us get a grasp on the ways in which both pro-slavery but also anti-slavery sentiment and political action were infused in the American nation from its founding moment. I think that's made very clear in these primary sources and in Alan Taylor's selection from American Revolutions. So just to wrap this up, as I said at the beginning, just as a reminder, two things. One, your second primary source essay is due next Friday, the 10th. That is also stated in the amended course syllabus. I will send out the instructions for it, or I'll post them on Blackboard today, which is April the 1st, Wednesday, April the 1st. But that those instructions are the exact same as the first primary source paper. And as I also said, speaking of the first primary source paper, I will have an opportunity to go get them from my office at Queens College tomorrow, April the 2nd. So I'm hoping that by Friday I have all of your grades up until this point posted on Blackboard. So I'm going to sign off here, but if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me. Otherwise, just keep an eye out for an email from me with the primary source essay instructions that are due next week. Okay, stay safe, and I will see you next week.